For the CEO, the board and the future of the company, my workshop with them was critical. Prior to the 5-day workshop, when I was introduced to the senior management team, a group of 12 men, the CEO stated that unless the team started to work towards the new joint vision, major resistors would be quickly identified and managed out of the organisation. One of the buzzwords for you're fired. You're fired in organisational change jargon back then. I've just had a flashback to the early episodes of The Apprentice and He Who Must Not Be Named. The CEO also added that he expected all gripes and resistance to be sorted out in the workshops so they could find ways to move forward. If I recall correctly, we will work all of this shit out were some of the words he used. My stress and anxiety before the conference was off the Richter scale. My internal tremblings, if they'd been part of an earthquake, would have been enough to divide Australia into 2 islands. I spent the entire weekend agonising. Have I forgotten anything? Had I done enough deep research to ensure I had backup plans for my backup plans? Did I need another 100 inspirational quotes up my sleeve and ready to use at any time if necessary? It seemed that every moment was consumed with ticking off of imaginary lists in my head. And of course I'd created lists that were ticked off and then lost or deemed inadequate. When I expressed my doubts to my husband, he said, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." This was supposed to be encouraging, but the voices in my head screamed, "How do you know that?" The conference started, and after 4 very long days and nights, there was a sense of excitement for the future. Major breakthroughs had been had, new bonds had been formed, barriers had broken down, there'd been laughs, aha moments, and lots of personal sharing. They made plans and commitment to the team and were ready to lead, inspire, encourage and support each other. All, including the CEO, were thrilled with the results thus far. The conference has exceeded my own or any other person's expectations, and at lunchtime of the second to last day, I had one of my Pammy brainwaves. It was exciting and would be fabulous to close the conference the next day. After a quick word with the CEO and gaining his agreement, I ran around like a headless chook to get that final afternoon session organised. I made an announcement, there's no such thing as certainty. The afternoon session was to be changed. I read them the stories about Sister Mary. I told them about the proud and happy book concept and how rarely we take time to reflect on the positives in life. The task for the afternoon was to write at least one thing that they'd like to encourage each participant for, acknowledge each participant for. They could write as little or as much as they wanted and were potentially given a lasting gift to one of their new teammates. I gave them the next 4 hours to work on their own and write their list. They could sign or remain anonymous, and they were to return it to me prior to our final dinner together. I'd collate them so each person had an individualised list, which I'd hand out at the review of the objectives and the closing speech by the CEO. For the entire afternoon while they were doing this, I wrote my own thoughts about how each participant had added value to the conference. I was really excited with how well the participants had accepted the challenge, but also blissfully unaware of how this spontaneous activity, what I now call doing a Pammy, would come back and bite me on the bum. All the lists were returned to me. At the dinner, some participants shared how much they enjoyed the exercise, and there are a few confessions about how hard it was to write a compliment and how their default thinking was always to look for flaws. This final dinner was filled with laughter, enthusiastic conversations and all the feel-goods that bring joy into my life. When I finally left my room at about 11 p.m, I was exhausted. I'd been trying to leave for about an hour, but kept being asked questions or getting included in conversations. As I started to sort the lists, I realised I hadn't accounted for all the steps that were necessary to get this ready for the 7:30 a.m. start the next morning. What I thought had been a great idea kept me sitting on the floor until the wee hours, and as I finally unfolded myself to flop into bed, I was started to doubt whether this new brainwave was worth the effort. Sleep didn't come easily as I was fearful I'd not wake up in time, but also the entire conference could finish not with a bang but a whimper, thanks T.S. Eliot. I missed breakfast because I was so exhausted and a bit slow. By the time I entered the conference room brightly saying, "Good morning all," I'd once again put on my shiny, happy, positive consulting face. Actually, this was not just my consulting face, it was a face I felt I had to show to everyone because I thought I had to be perfect. The morning went as follows: blah blah, the CEO's amazing speech and thanks to all, blah blah, summary of objectives, blah blah, what each person had learned from the conference, what commitments they were making to move forward as a team member, blah blah. It may sound incredibly dismissive of all the major outcomes of this conference, but all I could focus on was a moment when I'd have to give out these envelopes. At last, just prior to the official end of the workshop, I handed them out. I asked everyone to read the contents in silence. These were theirs to keep, and I hoped it had been a rewarding experience for them. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. I remember short intakes of air, looks across the room to catch someone's eye, nods of recognition, a few tears being wiped. If I could have bottled the atmosphere in that conference room in those moments, I'm sure we've bottled world peace. I started to close the workshop with some famous last words, an inspirational quote I was going to leave them with, when I was stopped by, "Hang on a minute." One of the most resistant, most cynical managers stood up and declared he had a few words he'd like to say. When he stood up, I got myself ready for the normal blah blah thanks. But no, he said he had a major criticism about something that had really pissed him off. I felt as if I was either going to be sick or faint, my ears ringing and my mind was screaming. Panic thoughts raced through my head, but somehow I nodded, put a smile on my face and said, "Of course, I value your feedback." My greatest fears were going to become true. I was going to be publicly shamed. He said he'd spoken to most of the other participants and they had agreed with him. No, please stop. Why didn't you put your name on the acknowledgement sheet? I had some really good shit I wanted to write to you. He then said said some very nice things that I didn't really hear, and he started to clap. And with all of the rest of my boys stood up and gave me a huge round of applause. Of course I cried and cried, not moving except to look each one of them in the eyes and mouthing thank you. I was moved by their genuine kindness, but my overwhelming emotion at the time was massive relief I hadn't messed up, that I hadn't been publicly ridiculed. They asked for my email address, which I gave them, and each participant emailed me with their acknowledgements. Some emails were a few sentences, others were detailed and profound. I thought then that maybe I should start a proud and happy book of my own, but that was a fleeting thought as I had the next conference to worry about, research to do, backup plans and backup plans and backup plans to create, and more inspirational quotes to be found. Over the next 15 years, whenever I've organised a conference, worked with a team over a long period, spent time with my many coaching clients, or needed to help friends who are going through difficult times, I've used some version of Sister Mary's story and the Proud and Happy Book concept, with a touch of Oprah's gratitude journals, and has added a huge value to many lives. Yes, dear reader, nearly 30 years after creating the very first Proud and Happy book, I finally started my own.